Berlin, 1939. In the Reich Air Ministry, war was discussed with the calm certainty of men who believed the future had already been decided. Maps of Europe lay open, their borders already shifting. Reports arrived from across the Atlantic, dry columns of figures describing American aircraft production plans. The numbers were vast, almost careless in their scale. When they were read aloud, Hermann Göring did not lean forward. He smiled, then he laughed. German intelligence reinforced the mood. The United States, analysts concluded, was slow and divided, burdened by politics and protected by distance. Its factories were scattered and civilian in character, its air force small by European standards. America possessed resources, yes, but not readiness. Potential, not power. In Berlin, this distinction mattered. Wars were not won by what a nation might become, but by what it could deploy now. Within the Luftwaffe, planners trusted experience over capacity. They had seen results. Poland had collapsed under air attack. Modern warfare, as they understood it, rewarded initiative and skill. Elite pilots, advanced aircraft, decisive doctrine, these were the currencies of victory. Numbers, by contrast, were abstract. They belonged to economists, not aviators. Göring mocked the arithmetic because it violated this understanding. Tens of thousands of aircraft suggested a war of endurance, not movement. A war decided by output, not brilliance. That kind of conflict felt remote, even implausible. Germany fought quickly. Germany finished wars. Long campaigns were theoretical problems, not practical ones. Beyond Germany's borders, Europe burned. Armies mobilized. Cities prepared for bombardment. Yet across the ocean, America remained formally at peace. Congress debated neutrality. Factories produced automobiles and appliances. Airfields were quiet. To Berlin, this silence looked like confirmation. The war, it seemed, would be settled before the United States ever chose a side. Confidence, once useful, hardened into doctrine. Assumptions became plans. Laughter became policy. Germany prepared for a short war shaped by experience and speed. What its leaders could not see was that elsewhere, far from the front lines, silence did not mean indecision. It meant preparation, measured not in speeches, but in numbers that had already begun to move. In 1939, the United States did not look like a nation preparing for air war. Its skies were quiet, its airfields modest, its military aviation force small and unevenly equipped. The U.S. Army Air Corps existed, but it lacked both modern scale and modern urgency. Compared to the air forces already fighting over Europe, America's fleet appeared thin, more experimental than formidable. Aircraft production reflected this reality. While Germany and Britain measured output in thousands, American factories produced in hundreds. Designs changed slowly. Procurement lagged behind doctrine. The United States had engineers, materials, and capital, but none of it was yet aligned toward war. Aviation remained a specialized industry, not a national mission. Factories were scattered across the country, built for civilian efficiency rather than military speed. Assembly lines turned out passenger planes, mail carriers, and private aircraft. Tools were not standardized. Parts were not interchangeable. Each manufacturer followed its own methods, its own tolerances. What existed was craftsmanship, not scale. Public opinion reinforced the inertia. Isolationism dominated American politics. The memory of the First World War remained fresh, its costs still debated. Rallies called for distance, not engagement. Neutrality was framed as wisdom. For military planners, this climate made expansion difficult to justify. Budgets faced resistance. Warnings sounded abstract. A war across the ocean felt remote. Inside the War Department, some officers argued quietly for preparedness. They spoke of air power, attrition, and industrial depth. But without public urgency, their arguments moved slowly. Planning papers accumulated. Production schedules did not. From Berlin, The view was reassuring. German observers saw no industrial threat across the Atlantic. America's factories appeared unfocused, its politics hesitant. Even its aircraft, they believed, lagged behind European designs. The laughter that had greeted American production claims now felt earned. If this was the nation Germany feared, it did not yet show it. The United States looked peaceful, divided, and unready, rich in potential, but distant from action. What no foreign intelligence service fully grasped was that beneath this calm surface, calculations were already being revised, and that peace, once abandoned, would not slow America down. At first, strategic bombing was understood as a test of courage and accuracy. Crews flew long distances, navigated hostile skies, and returned, or did not, based on skill and chance. But as the war widened, another truth emerged with brutal clarity. Air war was not a contest of daring alone. It was a contest of output. Aircraft fell from the sky at a steady, unforgiving rate. Engines failed. Pilots were lost. Machines were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Every sortie consumed not just fuel and ammunition, but time. Time measured in training hours, factory shifts, and transport schedules. Losses were not anomalies. They were constants, and constants demanded replacement. Germany believed quality would compensate. Superior design, better trained pilots, and refined tactics would, they assumed, keep losses manageable. Precision would offset scarcity. The Luftwaffe's confidence rested on the idea that fewer, better machines could dominate larger, less skilled forces. It was an elegant theory, one shaped by early success. Across the Atlantic, the United States approached the problem differently. Quietly, methodically, planners began to study the math, not the romance of flight, but its arithmetic. How many aircraft were lost per month? How many pilots could be trained per year? How long engines lasted? How quickly factories could expand? The questions were not inspiring, but they were decisive. Air power, in these calculations, ceased to be heroic. It became industrial, an equation balancing production against attrition. Victory depended less on brilliance in the cockpit than on continuity in supply. A single aircraft mattered less than the stream behind it. Slowly, the battlefield began to shift. The decisive struggle was no longer only over cities and front lines, but over factories, rail yards, and supply chains. Steel, aluminum, and labor hours became weapons. Assembly lines became extensions of the front. Few recognized the implications in full. Fewer still understood the scale at which this new war would be fought. To many observers, numbers remained abstractions, impressive perhaps, but distant from combat reality. What they did not yet grasp was that once air war became arithmetic, the nation best able to solve the equation would decide the outcome long before the enemy ever came into view. The Luftwaffe entered the war with confidence earned, not imagined. Its early campaigns had validated everything German air doctrine promised. Poland collapsed under concentrated air attack. France fell with stunning speed. Enemy air forces were shattered before they could adapt. To those watching from Berlin, these victories felt conclusive. They did not suggest a need for revision. They suggested confirmation. At the center of this confidence stood a belief in superiority, technical, tactical, and human. German aircraft were advanced, carefully engineered, and refined through combat. More important still were the men who flew them. Luftwaffe doctrine prized the elite pilot, rigorously trained, battle-hardened, and expected to survive long enough to accumulate experience. Skill, not numbers, was the decisive factor. Victory flowed from mastery. This philosophy shaped production itself. Aircraft were built with precision in mind, not speed. Designs evolved continuously, incorporating improvements even at the cost of manufacturing efficiency. Variants multiplied. Performance was pursued relentlessly, even when it complicated maintenance or slowed output. The assumption was simple. Fewer superior machines, flown by superior pilots, would always prevail. Experience substituted for redundancy. Losses were treated as temporary disruptions, not structural risks. A seasoned pilot was worth more than any assembly line. Replacements would learn in combat, as veterans once had. The system assumed continuity. That time would always be available to accumulate skill. At the highest levels, leadership believed wars were decided quickly. The First World War was remembered as an aberration, not a warning. Future conflicts, they believed, would be shorter, sharper, and resolved through decisive blows. Long wars of attrition were dismissed as theoretical constructs, unworthy of shaping real planning. Within this framework, industry occupied a secondary role. Factories existed to support operations, not to define them. Production was important, but only insofar as it enabled the next campaign. There was little sense that output itself could become the battlefield. Strategy lived in headquarters and cockpits, not on factory floors. This faith in superiority was not irrational. It was built on evidence, reinforced by success, and shared across the command structure. It created coherence and confidence, but it also narrowed vision. By assuming that quality would always outrun quantity, Germany committed itself to a form of warfare that left little margin for error. What went largely unexamined was what would happen if the war did not end quickly, if experience could not be replaced fast enough, and precision could not keep pace with loss. By the time these questions became unavoidable, the answers would already be arriving, not in the sky, but on the factory floors of a nation that treated industry not as support, but as strategy. Germany entered the war with formidable industrial skill, but without industrial unity. Aircraft production was spread across competing firms, each protective of its methods, its designs, and its influence. Rather than a single coordinated system, the aviation industry functioned as a collection of rival workshops. Competition was encouraged, not consolidation. In peacetime, this had driven innovation. In war, it fractured effort. Central planning existed, but it resisted standardization. Designers were allowed, even encouraged, to pursue incremental improvements during production. Changes were introduced midstream. Blueprints shifted. Tooling was revised repeatedly. What was gained in performance was lost in time. Assembly lines slowed as they adapted again and again to new specifications. Political interference compounded the problem. Decisions about which aircraft to prioritize were shaped not only by battlefield need, but by influence and prestige. Projects backed by powerful patrons survived long past their usefulness. Resources were diverted to favored designs. Rationalization yielded to rivalry. The system rewarded ambition more than efficiency. As a result, aircraft variants multiplied. Engines, airframes, and components differed subtly but significantly across models. Maintenance grew complex. Spare parts became less interchangeable. Training burdens increased. What should have been a streamlined pipeline became a maze of exceptions. Each variation demanded specialized labor, specialized tools, and specialized logistics. Skilled labor soon emerged as a bottleneck. Germany's aviation industry depended heavily on experienced craftsmen, men whose expertise could not be replaced quickly. As the war expanded, these workers became scarce. Some were drafted, others were diverted. Attempts to substitute unskilled or forced labor yielded limited results. Precision manufacturing resisted simplification. Efficiency, meanwhile, was sacrificed to prestige. Advanced designs promised superiority, but demanded time and care. The pursuit of excellence overshadowed the need for volume. Factories produced remarkable machines, but not enough of them. Output rose, but never explosively. There was no mechanism for sudden expansion, no reserve capacity waiting to be unleashed. The system could function at a steady pace. It could refine, it could improve, but it could not surge. When demand spiked, production strained rather than multiplied. Losses at the front translated directly into shortages behind it. Germany did not fail to build aircraft. It failed to build a system that could absorb shock. Industry was treated as a craftsman's domain, not a strategic weapon. Factories were expected to support operations, not to define the limits of war itself. This choice was not accidental. It reflected belief that wars would be short, that superiority would endure, and that numbers would never outweigh skill. But elsewhere, a different assumption was taking hold, that the true measure of power was not how finely a machine could be built, but how many could be replaced. And once that assumption was acted upon, the imbalance became irreversible. Long before the United States entered the war, a quiet assumption guided its planners, one rarely spoken aloud, but decisive in its consequences. They believed the war would be long, not a campaign of weeks or months, but a test of endurance measured in years. This belief did not shape speeches or headlines, it shaped calculations. From this premise followed a different understanding of power. Industrial capacity was not a supporting element of war. It was the war's decisive weapon. Battles would be won not by single moments of brilliance, but by sustained replacement of aircraft, of pilots, of material. The question was not how to win quickly, but how to continue indefinitely. Quantity, in this framework, was reframed as a form of quality. A reliable aircraft available in large numbers was more valuable than a superior one produced slowly. Redundancy was not wasteful, it was strategic. Losses were not failures, they were expected variables in a larger equation. Design philosophy reflected this shift. American engineers deliberately simplified aircraft wherever possible. Performance margins were balanced against ease of production. Systems were made accessible, forgiving, and consistent. The goal was not to build the best plane in the world, but to build a plane that could be built again and again without interruption. Standardization followed naturally. Components were made interchangeable across factories and models. Tooling was unified, processes were documented and repeatable. Variation was treated as a liability. Uniformity became doctrine. What mattered was not individual excellence, but collective momentum. At the same time, training pipelines expanded quietly. New airfields appeared across the country. Curricula were formalized. Instruction was broken into stages, scaled for volume. Pilots were trained not as artisans, but as part of a system designed to produce competence reliably. Experience would come later, if survival allowed it. To outside observers, the plan sounded implausible. The numbers were enormous, the timelines ambitious. Transforming a civilian economy into an engine of sustained air war seemed unrealistic, even naive. There was no dramatic announcement, no single moment of commitment. Only contracts signed, factories expanded, schedules revised upward. Yet once set in motion, the logic proved difficult to stop. Each increase in output justified the next. Each bottleneck exposed another solution. What began as preparation became acceleration. This was not confidence in victory. It was acceptance of reality. A belief that modern war punished hesitation and rewarded systems built for strain. And when the machinery finally began to turn at full speed, those who had dismissed the assumptions as arithmetic would discover that the calculations had been correct, and that they were already too late to change them. When the United States finally committed to war, it did not begin in the skies. It began indoors, beneath factory roofs, where civilian industry was stripped down and rebuilt with purpose. The transformation was neither elegant nor immediate. It was mechanical, deliberate, and vast. What had once produced comfort now produced necessity. Automobile plants were among the first to change. Assembly lines designed for cars were recalibrated for aircraft fuselages and engines. Conveyor belts were extended. Floor space was reorganized. Where chrome and upholstery once dominated, aluminum and rivets took their place. Production did not pause to admire the transition. It accelerated through it. This shift marked a deeper change in philosophy. Craftsmanship, long prized in aviation, gave way to assembly. Tasks were broken into smaller steps, repeatable and teachable. No single worker built an aircraft. Thousands built parts of one. Precision was preserved, but individuality was removed. The goal was not mastery, it was continuity. Labor itself was redefined. As men left for training and combat, women entered factories in unprecedented numbers. They learned quickly. They adapted. Their presence was not symbolic. It was structural. Entire production schedules depended on it. Riveting, wiring, inspection, roles once considered temporary, became permanent pillars of output. The war economy absorbed them without pause. As production expanded, time replaced terrain as the dominant measure. Schedules mattered more than formations. Deadlines mattered more than maneuvers. Success was tracked not by miles gained, but by units completed per week. The rhythm of war shifted from the battlefield to the factory clock. Speed overtook elegance. Aircraft were built to fly, fight, and be replaced, not to impress. Finishes were simplified. Processes were streamlined. Any improvement that slowed production was questioned, regardless of performance gain. Perfection became secondary to availability. In this environment, the air war was redesigned far from combat. Strategy was embedded in tooling layouts and logistics flows. Each decision, how long a task took, how far a component traveled, how easily a part could be replaced, carried consequences thousands of miles away. This was not improvisation. It was innovation under constraint. A system learning to move faster than its own expectations. What emerged was not just an increase in output, but a new understanding of how war could be sustained. By the time aircraft began arriving at the front in steady streams, the decisive shift had already occurred. The balance of power was changing not because of a single design or tactic, but because one nation had learned to prioritize factories before formations. And once that lesson was fully absorbed, the pace of production would begin to outrun every forecast made before the war began. As American production accelerated, a parallel transformation took place in design philosophy. Aircraft were no longer conceived for the exceptional pilot, but for the average one. The question was not how a machine performed in the hands of an ace, but how reliably it could be flown by thousands who had only months of training. This was not a concession to weakness. It was an acknowledgement of scale. Cockpits were simplified with intent. Controls were standardized in layout and function. Gauges were made legible at a glance. Procedures were reduced to essentials. The aim was clarity under stress. In combat, confusion killed as surely as enemy fire. American designers sought to remove it wherever possible. Maintenance followed the same logic. Ground crews could no longer rely on intimate familiarity with individual aircraft. They needed systems that worked the same way, every time, regardless of location. Repairs were broken into repeatable steps. Manuals replaced intuition. A mechanic trained on one airframe could service another without hesitation. Time on the ground was treated as a liability. Interchangeability became a quiet revolution. Parts were designed to fit across batches and factories. An engine built in one state could be installed in an aircraft assembled in another. Damage no longer meant delay. Replacement became routine. The aircraft was no longer a singular object, but a collection of standardized components moving through a system. This approach reflected a harder truth. Losses were expected. Aircraft would be shot down. Pilots would not return. American planners did not romanticize this reality, but neither did they avoid it. Attrition was calculated, planned for, and absorbed. The system was built to continue functioning despite failure. Survivability, paradoxically, improved through numbers. Not because individual aircraft were invulnerable, but because the presence of many reduced the burden on each. Missions could be rotated, fatigue could be managed, experience accumulated unevenly but steadily. No single loss threatened the whole. What emerged was resilience, a structure capable of enduring strain without collapse. Where other air forces depended on continuity of skill, this one depended on continuity of output. Where others feared loss, this system anticipated it. This did not diminish the human cost, it reframed it. Pilots were still required to face danger. Crews still bore the weight of responsibility, but they did so within a framework designed to support them, to replace what was lost, and to continue regardless. The result was not elegance, it was endurance, an air force shaped not by heroism alone, but by repetition and recovery. And as this system matured, it revealed a quiet advantage. It did not need perfection to succeed. It needed only to function, again and again, long enough for numbers to accumulate and momentum to build. By the time this logic reached the front lines in full force, failure itself had become manageable. And in a war decided by arithmetic, that difference would prove decisive. By 1942, the transformation became measurable. Monthly aircraft output, once modest and uncertain, began to rise sharply. Then it doubled, and then it doubled again. What had started as ambition hardened into momentum. Production curves that once climbed cautiously now rose almost vertically, defying earlier projections and overwhelming existing benchmarks. This acceleration was not accidental. Bottlenecks were identified and removed with methodical precision. When a shortage slowed output, it was isolated, analyzed, and resolved. Tooling was redesigned. Supply chains were rerouted. Entire processes were restructured if they cost even hours. Delay became the enemy. Efficiency, the doctrine. Government and industry aligned fully in pursuit of scale. Contracts standardized expectations. Information flowed without obstruction. Executives, engineers, and planners spoke a shared language of output and timing. Rivalries faded. Coordination replaced competition. What mattered was not who built the aircraft, but how many emerged, and how quickly. As production surged, logistics rose to equal importance with combat. Moving materials across a continent required as much planning as moving divisions across a front. Aluminum, engines, fuel, and labor had to arrive in sequence, without pause. Trains ran on new schedules, warehouses expanded. Inventory became a strategic reserve. The factory system learned to feed itself continuously. Aircraft now rolled off assembly lines without interruption. Day and night shifts blended together. Finished planes taxied directly from hangars to testing fields. Delays once measured in weeks were reduced to days, then hours. Output no longer depended on individual breakthroughs. It depended on rhythm. Across the Atlantic, Germany observed the numbers with growing concern. Reports confirmed rising totals, accelerating pace, and expanding capacity. But replication proved impossible. Germany's system could refine, but not multiply. It could adapt, but not surge. The gap widened not through innovation alone, but through sustained repetition. Momentum, once established, became irreversible. Each increase in output generated its own justification. Higher volume reduced costs. Simplification increased speed. Speed revealed new efficiencies. The system fed forward, compounding advantage with every cycle. By the time the scale was fully understood, it could no longer be countered directly. Production had outgrown prediction. Replacement had overtaken loss. The industrial engine was no longer accelerating. It was sustaining. What had once seemed implausible now became routine. Aircraft were no longer rare instruments of war. They were consumable assets, flowing steadily toward the front. And with each month that passed, the arithmetic of air war tilted further, away from experience, away from precision, and toward a force whose greatest weapon was not a single aircraft, but the certainty that another would always follow. The change did not arrive as a single moment. It came as accumulation. At first, Allied aircraft appeared in numbers that felt merely inconvenient. Larger formations, longer raids, more frequent crossings. Then the formations thickened, streams overlapped. The sky, once navigable, began to feel crowded. For the Luftwaffe, airspace itself became contested in a new way. German pilots now faced constant engagement. There were fewer quiet days, fewer pauses between alarms. Sorties followed one another without reprieve. Interceptions that once felt decisive now felt endless. Each mission ended only to be replaced by another forming beyond the horizon. The air war ceased to be episodic. It became continuous. Rest grew scarce. Experienced pilots flew again and again, their margins narrowing with each return. Fatigue accumulated invisibly. Slower reactions, dulled judgment, reduced tolerance for error. Attrition accelerated not because skill vanished, but because strain compounded. Even victories carried a cost. Across the Allied lines, losses mounted as well. Aircraft were destroyed, crews failed to return, but the effect was different. American losses were replaced almost immediately. New aircraft arrived on schedule. Fresh crews moved through training pipelines into operational units. Squadrons absorbed damage and continued forward without pause. For Germany, loss was final. Each aircraft destroyed represented weeks of production. Each pilot lost removed experience that could not be recovered quickly, if at all. The imbalance deepened quietly, measured not only in numbers, but in endurance. One side replenished, the other depleted. Air superiority did not shift overnight. It moved gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Then the balance tipped. German fighters arrived late to engagements or in insufficient numbers. Bombers reached targets more often. Escorts lingered longer. What had been contested airspace became, piece by piece, controlled. The psychological change followed the material one. Confidence gave way to calculation. Calculation gave way to concern. Reports from the front carried a different tone. The numbers could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration. They were present, visible, and unavoidable, etched across contrails that filled the sky. What Göring once mocked now demanded explanation. The arithmetic he had laughed at was no longer theoretical, it was operational. Each day's losses were tallied against a replacement rate that Germany could not match. By the time the shift was undeniable, the opportunity to reverse it had passed. The sky had filled not because of a single breakthrough, but because one system could sustain pressure while the other could not. And as air superiority hardened into fact, the consequences moved beyond the sky, toward the ground, the factories, and the final stages of a war that had already been decided by numbers long before they were believed. By the time the scale of Allied air power became undeniable, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting individual battles. It was fighting continuity itself. German aces, once the core of air superiority, were flown relentlessly. Sortie followed sortie, engagement followed engagement. Skill remained, but endurance eroded. Even the most experienced pilots could not outrun exhaustion. Repetition became the enemy. The same routes, the same alarms, the same overwhelming formations returning day after day. Where earlier victories had sharpened instincts, constant engagement now dulled them. Fatigue narrowed margins. Mistakes crept in, not from incompetence, but from strain. Experience, once an advantage, became a burden that demanded constant exposure. Behind the front lines, the pipeline thinned. Training hours for new pilots were reduced as fuel, and aircraft grew scarce. Replacements arrived faster, but learned less. What had once taken years was compressed into months, then weeks. The Luftwaffe no longer trained for mastery. It trained for adequacy, and even that proved difficult to sustain. Fuel shortages deepened the crisis. Experienced pilots found themselves grounded not by enemy action, but by empty tanks. Aircraft sat ready, but unfueled. Training flights were cancelled. Operational readiness declined quietly, invisibly, as resources were diverted elsewhere. Skill without fuel became irrelevant. At airfields across Germany, the contradiction was stark. Modern aircraft stood idle while crews were unavailable or untrained. Production had not stopped entirely, but it had outpaced the system's ability to use what it produced. Numbers alone could not save Germany now, because the supporting structure had already failed. In the air, tactics began to lose meaning. Interception plans assumed time, coordination and surprise, conditions that no longer existed. Allied formations arrived too frequently, too densely. There was no single decisive strike to disrupt them. Numbers absorbed losses and continued forward. Precision attacks dissolved into defensive reactions. Gradually, the Luftwaffe shifted posture, from offense to defense, from initiative to response. Missions focused on disruption rather than dominance. The objective was no longer control of the sky, but mitigation of damage. Retreat was not declared, but it was enacted. The psychological shift was profound. Pilots who had once hunted now waited. The sky no longer felt like a space to be mastered. It felt occupied, claimed. Experience, once the Luftwaffe's defining asset, could no longer compensate for the imbalance. The endless stream erased individual brilliance through sheer persistence. This was not defeat in a single battle. It was erosion. A system wearing down another system that could not replenish itself at the same rate. Each day the imbalance widened. Each night the calculation grew harsher. By the time German command fully understood what was happening, the logic was inescapable. The war in the air had crossed a threshold where recovery was no longer possible. The sky no longer belonged to those who knew it best. It belonged to those who could fill it again and again, without pause, without exhaustion, and without end. By 1943, the air war had moved beyond confrontation and into penetration. Allied bombers no longer sought only military targets at the front. They turned inward, toward the industrial core of Germany itself. Factories, rail hubs, refineries, and assembly plants, once distant from the battlefield, became the battlefield. The war that had been predicted in numbers arrived in steel and fire. German air defences strained under the pressure. Anti-aircraft batteries fired continuously. Fighter units scrambled again and again. But the tempo could not be matched. Bombing raids arrived by day and by night, overlapping, persistent, and increasingly precise. There was no recovery window. Damage accumulated faster than it could be repaired. Production began to fall, not suddenly, but steadily. Power outages slowed machinery. Transportation disruptions delayed components. Skilled labor was killed, displaced, or exhausted. Each interruption echoed through the system. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Allied output continued to climb, uninterrupted, protected by distance, and accelerated by scale. The disparity widened beyond correction. Control of the air slipped away in increments. German fighters reached fewer formations. Bombers flew deeper. Escorts stayed longer. Airspace that had once been defended became porous, then permissive. Commanders issued orders they could no longer enforce. Strategy outpaced capability. At the center of this collapse stood Hermann Göring, whose assurances grew increasingly hollow. He had promised protection. He had promised control. He had dismissed the threat of sustained bombing as exaggerated. Now cities burned openly, factories lay in ruins, and the sky belonged to the enemy. His words no longer aligned with reality. Public confidence eroded alongside material capacity. Reports contradicted speeches. Smoke contradicted denials. The gap between expectation and experience became impossible to ignore. Göring's authority, once unquestioned, dissolved under the weight of visible failure. The laughter of earlier years returned, but now it was bitter and directed inward. What was lost in the air could not be recovered on the ground. The industrial war had been decided long before the last bombs fell. Germany could no longer protect its production, nor replace its losses. Even when factories survived, the system supporting them did not. Output shrank while demand expanded, a fatal equation. This was not defeat by invasion or encirclement. It was defeat by imbalance. A system built for short war confronted one built for endurance. One exhausted itself trying to respond, the other advanced simply by continuing. By this stage, the outcome no longer depended on tactical brilliance or last-minute innovation. It depended on arithmetic already resolved. The numbers Göring had dismissed now governed every decision, every sortie, every loss. They could not be argued with. They could not be reversed. The war Göring could not stop was not fought solely in the sky above Germany. It was fought in ledgers, schedules, and production charts, places he had never believed decisive. And once those numbers turned against him completely, the end of the war became not a matter of if, but when. By 1943, the air war had moved beyond confrontation and into penetration. Allied bombers no longer sought only military targets at the front. They turned inward, toward the industrial core of Germany itself. Factories, rail hubs, refineries, and assembly plants, once distant from the battlefield, became the battlefield. The war that had been predicted in numbers arrived in steel and fire. German air defences strained under the pressure. Anti-aircraft batteries fired continuously. Fighter units scrambled again and again. But the tempo could not be matched. Bombing raids arrived by day and by night, overlapping, persistent, and increasingly precise. There was no recovery window. Damage accumulated faster than it could be repaired. Production began to fall. Not suddenly, but steadily. Power outages slowed machinery. Transportation disruptions delayed components. Skilled labor was killed, displaced, or exhausted. Each interruption echoed through the system. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Allied output continued to climb, uninterrupted, protected by distance, and accelerated by scale. The disparity widened beyond correction. Control of the air slipped away in increments. German fighters reached fewer formations. Bombers flew deeper, escorts stayed longer. Airspace that had once been defended became porous, then permissive. Commanders issued orders they could no longer enforce. Strategy outpaced capability. At the center of this collapse stood Hermann Göring, whose assurances grew increasingly hollow. He had promised protection. He had promised control. He had dismissed the threat of sustained bombing as exaggerated. Now cities burned openly, factories lay in ruins, and the sky belonged to the enemy. His words no longer aligned with reality. Public confidence eroded alongside material capacity. Reports contradicted speeches. Smoke contradicted denials. The gap between expectation and experience became impossible to ignore. Göring's authority, once unquestioned, dissolved under the weight of visible failure. The laughter of earlier years returned, but now it was bitter and directed inward. What was lost in the air could not be recovered on the ground. The industrial war had been decided long before the last bombs fell. Germany could no longer protect its production, nor replace its losses. Even when factories survived, the system supporting them did not. Output shrank while demand expanded, a fatal equation. This was not defeat by invasion or encirclement. It was defeat by imbalance. A system built for short war confronted one built for endurance. One exhausted itself trying to respond. The other advanced simply by continuing. By this stage, the outcome no longer depended on tactical brilliance or last-minute innovation. It depended on arithmetic already resolved. The numbers Göring had dismissed now governed every decision, every sortie, every loss. They could not be argued with. They could not be reversed. The war Göring could not stop was not fought solely in the sky above Germany. It was fought in ledgers, schedules, and production charts, places he had never believed decisive. And once those numbers turned against him completely, the end of the war became not a matter of if, but when. By 1944, the numbers no longer required interpretation. They spoke for themselves. The United States was producing aircraft at a rate once dismissed as fantasy, nearly 100,000 planes in a single year. Fighters, bombers, trainers, transports, all emerging from factories in a steady, relentless flow. What had once been a projection became routine. Output was no longer news. It was expectation. These numbers redefined air power. Strength was no longer measured solely by performance or range, but by continuity. The ability to replace losses immediately altered every calculation. An aircraft destroyed over Europe was already being replaced somewhere in the American interior. Air power ceased to be fragile. It became renewable. Individual aircraft mattered less than the stream behind them. A single bomber lost was tragic, but it did not halt operations. A squadron depleted could be rebuilt. A damaged unit could rotate out and return intact. The system absorbed shock without losing momentum. Flow replaced scarcity as the defining condition. Losses, once decisive, became manageable statistics. They were tracked, analyzed, and planned for, not celebrated, not ignored, but integrated. Attrition no longer threatened collapse. It became a variable to be managed. This did not diminish the human cost, but it changed its strategic weight. The war continued regardless. At this scale, coordination became a force multiplier. Allies synchronized production, training, and deployment. Aircraft built in one country were flown by crews trained in another, supported by logistics planned across continents. The air war became multinational not only in purpose, but in execution. Unity itself became industrial. Germany could not match the tempo. Even when production increased, it lagged behind replacement needs. Gaps widened, delays accumulated. Each month reinforced the imbalance. Germany's system responded. America's system advanced. The difference was not effort, it was structure. Victory in this environment was manufactured. Not improvised on the battlefield, not decided by singular moments of brilliance, but produced deliberately over time. Every rivet set, every engine tested, every airframe completed, contributed incrementally to an outcome already forming. This did not mean battles ceased to matter. Pilots still flew, crews still faced danger, missions still failed. But the strategic horizon had shifted. The war could now be sustained at a level the enemy could not endure. Time itself became an ally. The significance of 100,000 aircraft was not the number alone. It was what the number represented. A system capable of transforming intention into reality at unprecedented scale. A capacity to plan, execute, and repeat without exhaustion. What Göring had once mocked as arithmetic now governed the war's final phase. The sky over Europe reflected decisions made years earlier, decisions about factories, training, and standardization. By the time the count reached 6 figures, the conclusion was already embedded in the process. The outcome no longer hinged on who flew better or faster. It hinged on who could keep flying, month after month, without pause. And by that measure, the war in the air had already been decided, one aircraft at a time, until the numbers became too large to argue with. By the war's final years, the lesson was no longer contested. Industrial depth had proven more decisive than brilliance. Tactical genius still mattered. Courage still mattered. But neither could compensate for a system unable to endure loss. What decided the air war was not the perfection of any single aircraft or pilot, but the capacity to continue when perfection failed. The age of the lone hero had not ended, but it had been redefined. Individual skill still shaped outcomes in moments, but systems shaped outcomes over time. A well-trained ace could dominate a fight. A well-designed system could dominate a war. The difference lay in repetition. Heroes required preservation. Systems assumed loss and continued regardless. Planning for attrition, once seen as cynical, emerged as a form of realism. It acknowledged the nature of modern war without celebrating it. Losses were not desired, but they were expected. Building structures that could absorb them was not moral indifference. It was responsibility. It spared decision-makers from illusion and soldiers from impossible expectations. Adaptability, not pride, became the rewarded trait. Nations that adjusted their assumptions survived longer and fought more effectively. Those that clung to early success mistook confirmation for permanence. The war punished rigidity without ceremony. It did not care what had worked before. It cared only what could be sustained. Leadership choices echoed far beyond command rooms. Decisions made years earlier about standardization, training, and production manifested on factory floors and in the skies above Europe. Strategy was no longer confined to maps and arrows. It lived in schedules, tolerances, and output curves. Leadership in this war was inseparable from management. Air power itself was transformed. It ceased to be merely a contest of machines and men. It became an economic phenomenon. The ability to source materials, organize labor, and coordinate logistics proved as decisive as any tactical innovation. Air superiority was no longer seized, it was produced. This did not diminish the human cost. Thousands still died, cities still burned. But it clarified causation. Outcomes were shaped long before aircraft met in combat. The front lines were visible. The true lines of decision were not. Modern war revealed its nature without sentiment. It rewarded those who understood scale, accepted strain, and prepared for duration. It punished those who mistook early success for inevitability. The arithmetic did not bend to belief. What the numbers really meant was not just superiority in production. They meant foresight. They meant humility before complexity. They meant recognizing that no single moment decides a war of systems. In the end, the air war was not won because one side flew better or designed better machines. It was won because one side understood that modern conflict is not resolved by brilliance alone, but by the quiet, relentless alignment of planning, industry, and time. And once that truth asserted itself, it reshaped not only the outcome of the war, but the understanding of warfare itself, leaving behind a lesson written not in slogans, but in numbers that could no longer be ignored. In the beginning, the numbers were easy to dismiss. They arrived as projections, forecasts, and estimates, detached from the realities of combat as it was then understood. In Berlin, they were read aloud and rejected with confidence. Göring mocked figures he could not imagine made real. To him, war was shaped by experience, instinct, and decisive action. Arithmetic felt distant, impersonal, almost naive. Göring trusted what had worked before. He trusted early victories, elite pilots, and technical superiority. He trusted the belief that wars were short, that momentum decided outcomes, and that endurance was a secondary concern. In this framework, numbers mattered only after skill had failed. Germany planned accordingly. Across the Atlantic, a different trust quietly took hold. The United States placed its faith not in perfection, but in production. Not in brilliance alone, but in systems that could function under strain. It did not assume victory would come quickly. It assumed the opposite, that modern war would punish optimism and reward preparation. One side planned for a short war shaped by experience. The other planned for reality as it was becoming. That difference was not visible at first. It did not announce itself in speeches or battles. It revealed itself gradually through schedules, output charts, and training pipelines, through factories that never slept. As the war unfolded, the sky filled, not suddenly, but relentlessly. Aircraft appeared in numbers that changed behavior, then strategy, then outcomes. What had once been contested airspace became saturated. What had once been skillful defense became overwhelmed reaction. The consequences of earlier assumptions arrived without ceremony. Experience could not keep pace with replacement. Precision could not offset volume. The very strengths Germany had relied upon became vulnerabilities when confronted with a system designed to absorb loss. Each aircraft destroyed was replaced. Each pilot lost deepened the imbalance. The arithmetic that had been laughed at now dictated every engagement. There was no single moment when belief collapsed. It eroded. Confidence thinned. Explanations grew strained. Promises lost credibility. The laughter of 1939 did not echo in 1944. By then, the numbers were visible in contrails, in bomb tonnage, in factories reduced to rubble. They no longer required interpretation. This was not a moral failure of individuals, nor a simple triumph of machinery. It was a lesson in scale. Modern war did not reward those who fought best on a single day. It rewarded those who could continue fighting when days blurred together. It favored systems over instincts, planning over pride, The United States did not win the air war because it built the perfect aircraft. It won because it built enough and could keep building more. Germany did not lose because its pilots lacked courage or skill. It lost because courage and skill could not compensate for a system unprepared for duration. In the end, the sky became a ledger. Each sortie, each loss, each replacement entered into an equation that no longer favored experience alone. The war resolved itself not through surprise, but through inevitability. They laughed at the numbers once, because they did not yet understand what the numbers represented. They never laughed again,